All right, thanks everyone for coming to Gabriel's exhibition. I want to start by thanking the outside evaluator, Andy Robichaux. Andy is a historian at Boston University, and he is an environmental historian. He's written about the relationship of animals and cities in the 19th century. He's currently writing a history of ice and the ice trade in the 19th century. He's also a dear friend. And I'm really excited to have him as part of the discussion of Gabriel's work. This project started about a year ago. I was in lunch line, and Gabriel said he wanted to do an exhibition about the Bic pen. And his idea was to pull apart the different ingredients of the pen and write about the various connections that are inherent in an everyday object, something that can show us how deep our connections go, and especially our environmental connections. And so through his exhibition, he is going to ask you to also think deeply about your connections to the natural world through everyday objects. When he proposed this project, I immediately jumped on it. It's something that's familiar to me. Commodities histories have become a real fad among environmental historians. One of the reasons that they have so, why I wrote about concrete, Andy's writing about ice, other people have written about meat and bananas and whale oil and things like that, is because commodities help us to tell different types of stories that connect stories, that cross boundaries. And one of the things that was exciting in watching Gabriel's work progress in this exhibition was seeing the way this moved from a pretty strictly environmental perspective to a story that crossed a number of boundaries. And so one of the things I think that Gabriel came away with is that he couldn't really tell this history of connections without seeing the interconnections between environment, economics, culture, and probably many different other things. And so I think that it's been really cool to witness, and I'll let him talk about the connections that he found, and I will let Gabriel take it away.
Thank you, Gabriel. I want to start by also taking the time to thank some people. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for sponsoring me and introducing me to environmental history, which has quickly become one of the most interesting topics to me. And I'd like to thank Andrew Robichaux, for coming here and spending the time to look at my work, and Jody and Daniele and Clover, my dog, for coming to watch me give this presentation. Thank you, Og and Theoden, for studying with me in the 11th hour when it really counted most. Thank you, Cassius, for staying late up into the night with me and being a sage friend. And thank you, Phoenix, for putting up with me and being the best roommate and companion I could ask for. I'm going to start by saying that I've always been in connection with nature, and I think that's probably something that a lot of people in this room share. I spent my childhood gallivanting through the forests, running through the fields, and as I grew older, I noticed things start to change. I saw fires roll through the horizons, and the sun was frequently dimmed orange. I saw the trees turn brown on the slopes as the pine beetle ravaged the pines, and the seasons shifted, and the lead that sits in the groundwater under my house from the leaching of mine tailings. But it was always, whenever I asked about how this happened, I was told humans were the cause. But it was difficult to relate the actions that occurred in my life, the things I did, to these vast changes that were occurring in the scapes around us. And then last term, I took Environmental American History with Gabriel Lee, and we read a number of chapters from influential environmental histories. And this gave me a way to see through an academic lens the way that the human systems that we all engage with on a day-to-day basis really do directly cause these things that are ravaging the world around us. And when the opportunity for an exhibition arose, I wanted to figure out some way that I could tell all of you in this room, I could give all of you in this room a tool for a moment just to connect your life directly to these dramatic movements of industry that are causing our planet to change in various incredible and terrifying ways. And the answer to what would connect you to these stories was the Bic Crystal pen. I'd like to ask all of you, raise your hand if you've ever used one, if you've used this pen. Look at that. Nearly every one of you in this room, I think, has used this pen. That's why I'm using it as my focus point. It's so relatable to anybody. You have used this pen. You have come into connection with this thing. Not to mention the fact of the spin-offs, the round stick, the fabled ultra round stick grip, or the Papermate Ink Boy, and all of the other competitors and the knockoffs. Everybody can relate to the simple ballpoint pen. So I'm going to tell you the story of how this pen came into existence, the history behind it, and I'm going to give you a commodities history, which will connect the materials inside of this pen to the changes that are occurring on this planet. Don't worry, we'll talk a little more about what a commodities history is later. So I'll start out with the history of the ballpoint pen. The reason I'm talking about the history of the ballpoint pen is I want to ground you in the story of how this thing came to be, but also I love history. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's my fascination with stories, but knowing about how things emerged, how people affected the way we see the world, and the way things are today fascinates me. And I'll admit I got a little lost in the histories and the stories, but that's what my exhibition ended up becoming in part. So before I get into the history of the ballpoint, let's talk very briefly about the history of writing. Writing emerged in around 6,000 years ago, and it was used in Mesopotamia, in Sumeria, and Egypt, and it started out as impressions in clay, which was used for marking commodities, typically like copper or your goats or when you sold what, and then slowly through a long cultural process, it developed into the method of relating language we know today. And in Europe, over the Middle Ages, the common tool for writing developed was the quill, which was the flight feather of typically a goose. And then as metal became more available, that was transferred into a metal mimicry of the flight feather, which was the common dip pen or the fountain pen, which you might know of. And I want to take a moment to just relate or think about what's going on here. There is a shape that is formed through a bird's flight, the feather, the hollow feather, and this shape was conducive to writing. We could cut it in a certain way to allow ink to pool in a reservoir in it, and now factories across the world produce, with millions of pounds of materials extracted all over the world, mimicries of the flight feathers of a bird because it allows us to communicate language. I think it's incredible. But okay, so where we're going to start is with John J. Loud. In 1888, this fine individual produced the first common ancestor of the ballpoint pen, which he created to mark leather and rough surfaces, because if you have a ball, it can roll over all these different things. And it went unknown for 50 years. It wasn't common or known of or marketed at all until we get to Laszlo Biro, who in 1930 developed the predecessor to the ballpoint pen we know today. He was a Jewish-Hungarian journalist, and his inspiration came from his work. He was the editor-in-chief of a magazine, and as he sat in the printing room, he saw the printing press churn out thousands of copies of the magazine an hour, and he dreamed of a solution that could be as efficient as that magazine. And what he came up with was the principle behind the rolling tip is there's a brass housing that forms a ring that the ballpoint is just too big to fit through. And so when you're not using the ballpoint pen, it settles down due to gravity on that ring, forming a seal. And when you use the pen, you push it against the paper, and it pushes the ball up into a set of smaller balls, which allows it all to roll, and the ink can flow down over the ball, creating an even line. But there were some problems. At the time when Biro created this, most inks that were used were water-based inks, and they were typically gummy, and they took a long time to dry. And so the ballpoint pen wasn't very reliable. But in 1930s, he fled Europe because the first Jew laws were passed at the beginning of World War II. And he was at a resort randomly, and he met the president of Argentina, who invited him to move to Argentina and be like an inventor to boost the economy. And over World War II, he planned a series of or a series of businesses that would start producing the pen across the world at the end of the war, once commodities like copper were no longer being used for the war effort. And while he was planning this, and as the war ended, he was foiled in America by a man named Milton Reynolds, who was a businessman who came to Argentina in 1945. And when he saw the ballpoint pen, his thought was, I see money here. I must have my own version. And so he immediately went back to America and developed a patent for a ballpoint pen that was slightly worse than Biro's patent. And then he marketed it and he sold it later that year. He got it into market, and it was, this is a quote, this is a quote from that scene. Reynolds bought the new pen to market later that year with the tagline, "The miraculous pen that will revolutionize writing." The pen initially sold for $12.50, which is equivalent to $218 in 2024. The day the pen went on sale, an estimated 5,000 shoppers stormed Gimbels, and approximately 50 NYPD officers had to be dispatched for crowd control. Now, this pen did not take the country by storm or the world by storm, because it still had the problems that Biro was working with, the gummy ink, and it was a worse version than Biro's pen, and he was selling it for $218. So I don't know if that's a good marketing scheme, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Then, in 1949, Franz Sich, who was a chemist who worked at Papermate, developed what would allow the ballpoint pen to come to what it is today, and that's a glycol-based ink, an ink that is not water-soluble, so you can write with it underwater, it can't dissolve, and the ink dries to form a very thin film that's not gummy, so if there's any holes in the enclosure, it'll just film over any exposed surfaces and it won't dry out. And then in 1945, a small company called Bic started manufacturing pen parts, and coincidentally enough, in 1950, 1 year after Papermate released their new ink, Bic had a new ink solution that could do the same thing, and Bic created the first ballpoint pen, but their key difference was that this pen was made of a plastic body, and it was made to be as cheap as possible. Unlike all the others, which it was a luxury item following in the history of fountain pens, which were typically luxury items because writing came from a place of privilege, this pen was marketed to be cheap and easy to use, and that's how it took the world by storm. So now we come to a commodities history. How does this wacky story about a ballpoint pen relate to the environment and the changing and every one of you? And that is a commodities history. A commodities history is a comprehensive story of an object that is produced and distributed, and typically it includes how the object is extracted from the land, and the systems involved in its distribution, and the labor involved, and the effects on the environment, crucially. But I can't just do a commodities history of the ballpoint pen. It's too complex. It might seem simple, but there's already, 5 different things here? That won't fly. Notice when Gabriel was talking about commodities history, he talked about how his colleagues were an expert in ice. Gabriel is an expert in concrete. These are all single commodities. I chose a ballpoint pen which already has 5 different commodities, so I may be making mistakes from the start. But I needed to choose one to really focus in on for this presentation because I want to give you some depth. And so I'm excluding polystyrene and polypropylene because they're products of oil. And the story of oil is incredible and very interesting, but I don't think I can get so much depth in it in this time frame because it just is so vast. So I'm going to focus on one of the metals, and I chose to focus on brass because I think that there's some really interesting histories wrapped up in it. The reason I'm not talking about ink is because I hit a research stumbling block, and that is copyright. I found popping up over and over in my research that if either something had been, some event had happened in corporate history earlier than the 1940s, or if it had to do with the chemical process, it was like a blank slate, and you had to spend hours toiling through different patents and searching for little breadcrumbs about the stories. So I spent so much time looking into the ink only to come up with little fragments, not really anything, which was somewhat disappointing. So now we need to break it down one further step. Brass is an alloy of a few different metals: zinc, copper, and typically tin or lead, depending on what it's being used for. And I think for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on copper because it tells a remarkable corporate history. So, copper, finally, we're here at the commodities history. Copper has been mined for the past 6,000 years. And there are some veins that have extremely high copper content. That's why copper is the first metal that humans have extracted from the earth, because some veins have like upwards of 70% copper content, and you can smelt copper without necessarily using the technologies of a forge or of charcoal or bellows. Copper could theoretically be smelted just in a really hot fire. And that's why it was the first metal that was ever smelted. But copper in the Industrial Revolution really stems from two main ore deposits that determine everything that happens with copper's production and extraction. The first is massive sulfides ore deposits and porphyry deposits. I messed that word up so many times. And the first ore that was extracted was the massive sulfides deposit. I'm sorry, I need to bring in another thing. Sorry, hold on. Okay, the early extraction of the massive sulfates copper ore occurred through what was commonly known as hard rock mining, often in stump processes, where the miners would follow veins through the rock, and it was an extremely labor-intensive process. It was almost an artisanal craft, because the miner would have to read the rock and follow the ore vein properly, and they would extract the ore, but it was worth it because these sulfate deposits had such high copper content, sometimes in the range of like 20% copper, which was every block of ore you mined, you'd get a huge amount of copper. And so now we have to come back to a person, because I guess I just ground all these stories in people. This is Marcus Daly, and this brings us to Anaconda, silver, and gold. Marcus Daly was an Irish immigrant that came to America in the early or late 1700s, and he started to work as a newspaper salesman in New York. But eventually he moved all the way to California to follow the gold rush, and he had a lucky connection with a business magnate who was the father of William Randolph Hearst. And then he moved to Butte, Montana, to supervise a gold and silver mine in 1876. Now, while working at this gold and silver mine, when he would inspect the mine, he would come to the end of the silver and gold deposits, and at the end of the silver and gold deposits, he would find that there was a high concentration of copper in this sulfite ore, and he started thinking about what the copper concentration in this hill is. And so he went to all the different copper mines around the hill, and he went and all the different gold and silver mines that had been exhausted, and he went in and he did surveys at the ends of the tunnels and found that at the ends of all of the silver and gold deposits, there was all connecting to one huge copper deposit that was in the center of this whole geological formation that was in Butte. So he resigned from his job. He pulled a favor from that business magnate that he met to buy the Anaconda copper and silver mine, which was just next to the mine he was working at and which had gone out of business a while ago because the silver and gold had dried up and they didn't think to start mining the copper. And he bought all the mining claims around that mine, and then he began mining. And by 1800, the Anaconda copper mine had begun producing. And this is actually incredible timing. I don't know how Marcus Daly was this lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. Just a year before Thomas Edison had released the first advertisements of the incandescent light bulb. And this was like the herald of the electric revolution that was about to sweep across America. And the electric revolution required a conduit that could pipe electricity from the power plants to the houses to all of the systems that were building up, the lighting systems, the industrial systems that Edison was about to start getting going, along with Nikola Tesla in the AC/DC debate. And there were two potential metals for this position: silver and copper. Silver is extremely rare, but it is the most conductive metal. Copper is slightly less conductive than silver, but it's incredibly abundant. So copper presented itself as the thing that would become the lifeblood of the energy revolution in America. So Anaconda seems like it's at a great position right now, because Daly has just discovered this massive ore deposit that has very high copper. But let's look a little more closely at the two types of ore. The first one is the massive sulfides, which, as we see, it has 4 to 20% copper, which is incredible. But the size of the deposits typically only range from 1,000 to 10 million tons, which might sound like a lot, but it's not a lot in the grand scheme of the production, like how much copper is produced globally each year. And they're typically very uncommon. But porphyry deposits, which only contain about 0.5% or 2.5% copper, are much larger. They're 100 million or sometimes a billion tons of copper, and they're very common. And Anaconda knew, or Marcus Daly was constantly thinking about this. But the problem is, it was just not economic at this point to mine the porphyry deposits, because you could only get 0.5% sometimes or 2% sometimes. That would not pay. It just would not pay. The methods weren't efficient enough. And so what this demanded was a change in technology. And the new technology that emerged was open pit mining. Unlike stope mining, which could only mine around 6 tons per man-hour of work, open pit mining could mine up to 24 tons of man-hour per work. That like triples the amount of copper you can get out of every hour you have to pay somebody to work. And this kind of mining, the principle is that if the ore is so sparse, you just mine everything. You don't look for a vein. You just mine the whole surface level down to where the ore stops, and you process all of it. And this causes great ecological destruction. And the fact that the mines are no longer underground, with stoop mining, you're channeling through veins and tunneling for the copper, that keeps all the dusts in the mine, typically, I mean, for the most part, except the tailings. But for the open pit mining, the landscape becomes the mine. And with copper ore, it typically contains lead and arsenic. They're often in copper ore. So dusts would waft off these new open pit mines into the communities nearby and into the ecosystems, increasing lead levels and arsenic levels, or dramatically around pit mines, typically. But there was another problem in Anaconda's way. This type of endeavor needed so much capital, a single business to mine this much. Now, in our modern era of corporations, this might seem reasonable. But in the 1700s, companies didn't even think about producing on a scale this large, because it was, and so Anaconda had to figure something out. And the answer for Anaconda was to expand dramatically and basically pioneer a new form of business, along with other trust companies like Standard Oil. And so Anaconda began structuring its corporation by buying smaller mining companies and adding to its sum. Rather than paying its profits out in dividends each year, it would reinvest in other companies, dramatically increasing its size continuously. And it was so easy for Anaconda to increase, because the corporate buyout wasn't such a big concept back then. Companies weren't always at each other's throats to get to like consume each other to become bigger. This was a fairly new principle, so it was easy for Anaconda, if they just continued to put in the profits that they were making, to grow at a frighteningly exponential rate. Here's a quote from Marcus Daly about this. He says, the policy of the company from the beginning has been not so much to realize immediate returns as it has been to try to lay the foundation for the long life of an active and usefulness. For this purpose, the profits of the company have been expanded into enlarging and bettering the plants until today. But there was the other major paradigm shift that had to occur in corporations for them to achieve the scale that Anaconda was attempting for, was not only to grow upwards and expand all the copper mines, but also to grow horizontally, so to speak. And what I mean by that is Anaconda began to purchase companies that weren't even in the realm of copper mining, but in adjacent realms. Anaconda purchased railroad companies. Anaconda purchased electric companies so that they didn't have to pay other companies for the profits because they were just able to absorb everything. They could do it all themselves from the mine directly to the consumer. This is a quote from the next head of Anaconda about this principle. The time has come when we cannot compete in the industry if we only control one stage of the business. Anaconda is now able to operate its mines at a steady and economical rate. We have high prices during periods of scarcity and low prices during periods of depression. We believe that the great benefits will arise by the reason of this proposed merger. In this way, from the mine to the consumer, there can be only just and fair profit. The industry will be stabilized. And he's talking right now about a deal where Anaconda spent $50 million to buy American Brass, which was like the general brass producer of America at the time. So now Anaconda no longer just produces copper. They mine copper from the ground, they refine it, they turn it into brass, and they even mill it into the right shapes, and then they sell it to the consumer. So they don't have to pay any profit margins. They can completely control the market. And this is the blueprint that lots of large mining corporations and corporations in general have taken on today. After Anaconda pioneered this, there were a lot of laws put in place about price raising and how, as a corporation, you can't affect the prices of the market. And so it made it so that there was slightly less power for the corporations if they took a full monopoly, and there was a big anti-monopoly movement in America. But as I'm sure you see in your day-to-day life, that hasn't changed anything. There's still an enormously, unthinkably large corporation around every corner. In general, in the Anaconda story, I'd say if there was one thing I was sad that I didn't get to delve deeper into, that I was really hoping to focus on a lot, was the worker experience, because I wanted to relate this story directly to the people and the environment that was getting destroyed. And so I spent time looking for workers' accounts, but it was very difficult to find stories from the Anaconda mine, and I wonder why. Probably because the Anaconda Copper Company was extremely against anybody talking about the labor conditions. And then relating it to the present, modern mining companies use the same techniques that were pioneered in the Anaconda phase. Open pit mining is still one of the largest copper mining techniques, and copper mining has only increased dramatically over the past 20 years and from the time that Anaconda was mining. So copper mining has only increased, and the same technologies that Anaconda and the same systems that Anaconda pioneered are still being used today. Relating this back to the pen, we just talked about one piece of the history of copper, which is one piece of brass, which is one piece of this pen, which is one of the maybe slightly more manageable histories of all of these. So you can see the immense complexity and the immense webs and systems that this pen ties into, that this pen directly ties into. Every single time you buy or use one of these pens, the copper in the brass tip of the pen that holds the ball above the page was mined from one of these systems that I just discussed, and is a direct product of the histories we just talked about and the conglomerations of corporations. When I first thought about this project, I was a lot more ambitious, and my dream was to do a phone. And it might be interesting for a moment just to think about the amount of commodities that go into a single phone, the amount of systems. Maybe Kate Berry, it's probably an interconnected system or a complex system, and everything is involved. But I long to know every process that goes into every single commodity, that goes into every step of the fabrication of each one of these pieces, because I want to know how the world around me works, but I don't think it's feasible. But at least I've made a head start on the ballpoint pen. Some insights I learned along the way. This project was mainly research and writing an essay. I told you a story that was a single story from that essay. And this essay is definitely now a continuing project for me. I learned first and foremost that my eyes are bigger than my stomach. I wanted to know so much about every detail about this history and even more complex histories, and it was just impossible to get to all of it. I also learned that it was easy to get lost in information. I spent the first chunk of my exhibition just researching because I thought that I could gather all these stories and information together, and then I could masterfully spin it into a narrative in my essay. But as I got more and more stories and heard about more and more trends in the copper market and the labor trends and the different immigrant stories and all of the different technological changes, it spun around in my head, and it was very difficult to compile it into a story in the second half of my exhibition. And so I learned that going forward, the most important thing for me to do whenever researching is, as soon as I do research on something, immediately translating that to the page. Because I can't wait. I can't find more stories and try to weave it into a narrative. And I think I'm very glad I learned that on this project, because I'm going to college and I'll probably be doing more of this then. I'd recommend you to keep an eye out over the course of the next 10 years for a book titled The Devil in Your Hand, an Eco-Corporate History of the Humble Ballpoint Pen, because I'm sure it will happen. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that every time you use the pen, no matter how small the consideration is, think about the web that every piece of this pen is involved with, the complex production systems, the labor involved, the environmental impacts of the manufacture of every step of every piece of this pen. And every time you buy something like this pen, it is involved in one of these systems, and you are directly contributing to that system and perpetuating it. These are my sources, and this is my penultimate slide, and this is my ultimate slide. I will take questions now. Who is that? Owen? Owen.
Was Anaconda ever broken up like Standard Oil?
That's an interesting question. Anaconda kind of just continued growing in size through various changes. Standard Oil was involved. Standard Oil invested in the Anaconda, in this amalgamated copper corporation, and Anaconda was one of the main corporations in the amalgamated copper corporation. And then when they cracked down on Standard Oil and began taking these things apart, the amalgamated copper corporation was dissolved. And because Anaconda was so big and it was at the heart of this corporation, it absorbed all the others and got even bigger. The reason Anaconda fell apart was because Anaconda owned a huge mine in Chile, and during the socialist revolution, the mine was taken from Anaconda, and it marked a huge portion of their revenue. And then once Pinochet overthrew the socialists and took back the country, oh my God, I'm not a Pinochet fan. But once Pinochet took the country from the socialists, he paid Anaconda $250 million, which is a lot, but it's kind of a token sum because that mine represented such a large portion of Anaconda's industry, and each mine took so much resources to just get up and going. And then Anaconda began to decline in its other mines. It lost its mine in Mexico because it began to export labor around the globe. And when it lost its mine in Mexico, it sold out, and it sold to another company in the United States called Asarco, I think, and this was around the time when Superfund was becoming very pushed across the country that Superfund sites were being created. And so Anaconda became a burden to anybody who owned it because they owned so many pit mines that by this point were pretty exhausted, which just meant huge reclamation processes. So Anaconda kind of became a husk in some ways. And it's still owned, I think, by Sarco, and there's lots of reclamation processes that are required to happen, and it's being a huge money drain for them.
How